Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. In the previous lesson, we defined schemas and set default values for our React Hook forms. In today's lesson, we'll create type-safe form inputs that will provide client-side validation and give users immediate feedback. I'll provide a link to all resources in the description. And I'll also provide a link to join my Discord server where you can discuss this Next.js Full Stack project with fellow students, ask questions, and help each other out. Hey guys, a big shout out and thank you to Sentry for making this full stack Next.js educational video series possible. Sentry is defining debuggability in full stack web applications, and I consider Sentry to be an essential part of my tech stack. From error reporting, logging, and tracking to identifying performance issues with tracing, to user session replays, and much more, Sentry will help you write and ship code that delivers exceptional user experiences. Follow the Sentry links in the video description or just visit Sentry.io and use the code davegray to get 3 months of the Sentry team plan for free. In this Next.js Full Stack Project series, I'm using the same tech stack that I've been working with on a major project at my job over the past year. For viewers, students, and subscribers that have asked what I work with on a daily basis, this is definitely the tutorial series to watch. I've got VS Code open and we're looking at our user stories for our repair shop app. And much like the last lesson, we are working on user story 14 and 15, where all users can create and view tickets and all users can create, edit, and view customers. These are our goals for the tickets form and for the customers form. So let's continue with that today by creating new inputs that we can populate our forms with. And those inputs are going to provide validation and give the users immediate feedback. Let's open a terminal window by pressing Control and the backtick, and to create these inputs, we're going to need to install some ShadCN components. So I'm going to type npx, need the N first, there we go, npx ShadCN at latest, and then I want to type add, and now we'll type the names of the components we need. We need input, we'll also need select, we're going to have a text area, and a checkbox. Now, ShadCN now currently supports the new version of Next.js, that's Next.js 15, that's stable now. It also supports React 19, but it's going to ask us some questions as we go through this. So I'll press enter. Okay, when it asks how would you like to proceed, I'm going to choose use legacy peer deps and press enter. Now it should complete installing those 4 components that we need to create our inputs. So we've got input, select, text area, and checkbox. Now, while we have a terminal window open, let's go ahead and start our project with npm run dev, and this should start the Next.js project in dev mode, and we can launch it at localhost 3000, and then we'll need to go to either the login page if you need to log in, or if you're already logged in, you can go straight to the /home page. So we'll pull that up here. It takes just a minute to compile, but not too long, and we've got the home page up now, so I should now be able to go to /login if I need to log in. And if you do need to log in, you're going to have to enter in your email address. It's going to email you the code. So I'm going to quickly enter mine with dave@davegray.codes. I recently had somebody send me a code at this email address. So remember to enter your email address, not mine. Now I'm going to enter my code as soon as I receive it, and I'll meet you at the home page of the app. And I've launched the app. I'm in dark mode, and here we are at the home page now that I have logged in. Now, let's quickly look at the ShadCN website for forms. And I have clicked on form, not React Hook form specifically, but in the left-hand side where ShadCN lists the different components, I've clicked on form over here. And this is the page we get, but he talks about using React Hook form. I looked at this briefly with you in the last video because I talked about why I was choosing to use React Hook form, and I'm using Zod as well. But now I just want to show the examples here. And when we look at the anatomy of how you create a form component with ShadCN using React Hook form, it looks like this. Now, for every input we want to have on our page, if you can imagine, say, the customer page where we have the first name, last name, first line of the address, second line of the address, city, state, zip, and so on, you would have one of these essentially for every one of those inputs. Now that can get kind of cluttered. So what it would be better to do would be to create one component, one input component, if you will, that we can extract, then we can just import it into our form, and it won't clutter up the form component. And then, of course, we'll have this in a separate component. So that's what we're going to do with those 4 different inputs that we installed. We have input, we have a text area, we have a select, and a checkbox. So let's get to work back in VS Code on our input component, and you'll see how it all works with React Hook Form. Okay, we're back in VS Code. I've got the file tree showing over here. Let's go to the components directory that we have in our project. Here it is. Inside the components directory, you should also have a UI directory, and that's where ShadCN installs the different components that we have added to the project. I want to create another new directory inside of the components directory, and I'm going to call this one inputs. And then inside of inputs, I'm going to create my first component. I'm going to call this input with label.tsx. And this will be our form input. So I'll start with use client. All of these will be client-side components. Then I'm going to import use form context from React Hook Form. And the use form context is going to let us pull in the form and reference it inside of this separate component. So it doesn't all have to be in the form component that we were creating. Then we can import this back into that form component. Okay, after that, we need several things from ShadCN. So we'll just start the list of imports here. We need form control. We also need form field. And then we need form item. And then form label. And finally, form message. Okay, all of these are going to come from @/components/UI/form. Okay, but we're not quite finished with ShadCN yet. We also need to import the input component, and that's going to come from @/components/input, not inputs, just, oh, we need the UI, there we go, UI/input. And finally, I'm going to import input HTML attributes. That comes from React. And I'm doing that because I want to extend the props so I can send other props into this component if I want to. So those are our imports to start out with. Now let's go ahead and type out the props that we're going to pass in. So I'm going to say type props equals, and some people prefer to use an interface. I like using props, is what I usually use. And I'm going to use a TypeScript generic here also, and this is going to help our type safety. So I'm going to say S here. Sometimes you see T as well, so you could use that if you want to. I'll say S. And then inside of this, and by the way, S is for schema, because that's what I'm going to pass in to make sure that the input matches, or the validation input matches what we have available in our form. So you'll see how that works in a moment, but first let's put in our field title prop. That will be a string. Then I'm going to say name in schema, and this is really what we're matching here with that generic. So I'm going to say key of S, which is a key of our schema, and it's going to be a string. Then class name. So if we want to pass in any classes, we can. So this will be optional. It would also be a string. But then at the very end, since I also want to possibly pass in other props that are just natural to the input, I'll add that input HTML attributes, and we'll say this is an HTML input element type. That will let us spread in the props, and so anything else we would normally pass to an HTML input will be able to do so. Okay, so now we have export function input with label is what we're calling this, and it will receive that generic. So that's our S again for schema right there. And now we'll get the props here. So we'll have field title, we'll also have name in schema that we listed above, we'll have class name, and then we'll spread in the props as well. Okay, after that, we still need to have props here after our destructured object here. So I'm going to say props, and once again, we need to have that generic there as the S for the schema. Okay, now we're ready for the body of our function. And by the way, I should say, I know generics, and if you haven't worked with them a whole lot, don't let this freak you out. I'm going to show you how easy it is to just pass in our schema here and match everything up. So it'll just give you a little extra type safety with these inputs. Okay, now I'm going to say const form, and I'm going to set that equal to use form context. So this will let us reference our form inside this component. And now we're ready for the return, which is essentially that anatomy of the form field that we saw in the ShadCN docs. So I'm going to say return, have my parentheses here, and we'll start off with our form field component from ShadCN. And it has a control prop. We'll set that equal to form.control. And after that, we're going to have the name, and that's going to be equal to the name in schema that is passed in. And then we're going to have a render method here. So we'll have render equals, and inside of this, we'll have a function, and there we can destructure the field here from React hook form. Okay, now we'll have an arrow here for our anonymous function. And let's go ahead, whoops, not a curly brace, but parentheses now. And inside this parentheses, a lot of things are going to go in here. So let's go ahead and start with our form item. It has a closing form item tag, that's correct. Now we'll have our form label. Now the form label will have a class name. We're going to set this equal to just text base here. And then an HTML4, just like a for attribute would be on an HTML element. In React, we use an HTML4. This is going to be the name in schema once again. And then we can close out our form element. And now this, or our form label element, and this is where we'll have our field title that is passed in. So that's actually what would be seen on the screen for the label. Now after that, let's come down an extra line there and let's separate this. So we'll have our form control. Now inside the form control, we're going to have our input. Start the input, go down to a new line because it's going to have several props. One is the ID. Now this needs to match whatever the HTML4 is. So once again, it's name in schema. After that, we're going to have a class name prop here. Now I'm going to set this equal to, well, first we'll have curly brackets, but then a template literal string. I'm going to hide the file tree so we have a little more room. Now this is worth a little bit of discussion because we can pass in the class name here. It's optional. So if we want to add more classes, but because I'm not creating a component library, this is a specific application, I have some classes that I pretty much always want to apply to these inputs, or this any text input like this one. And so I'm going to put them here, but then we'll put class name at the end of the list, and that will let us overwrite any of these classes that we put in case we want to, or we can add classes to it anytime we want to. So now I'm just going to put in the classes that I'm probably always going to want to apply. So I have width full, max width set to extra small. Then I'm going to set some colors here that are just going to match what I plan to do with the application. These might be ones we would want to override at some point, but they'll also be just specifically for if the input is set to disabled. We'll have text-blue-500. And if we're in dark mode and the input is disabled, then we're going to have text-green-500. I'm going to press Alt-Z to wrap all of this down. After that, one more, disabled. Going to have an opacity equal to 75%. And now I'll just pass in that class name that will let us overwrite any of these classes or add to them if we want to with this component. Okay, after that, we still need to spread in the props that are received above, and we need to spread in the field. And this field comes from React hook form right here in this render method that we're in the middle of creating right now. So there's the field. We spread it into the input. That handles the on change and other things that you would expect the input to have working inside of React hook form. So we don't have to specify each one of those. Now we're almost finished, but we need to put in that form message that we imported as well. And this is where the message would go if we have a validation message. If something isn't right, we're going to give the user that immediate feedback. Okay, after the form item, and we've closed out the render method here, then we need to close out the input itself. So we put a slash and a caret there, or the greater than sign, I should say, and that closes it out, and we should be finished with the component. So let's go back up and see where all of this started. We're in the return here, so that's where the parentheses are. Come down, we can see the end of that. So we just closed out this form field with this slash greater than right there. Okay, and that is the input component. Let's go ahead and put it to work inside of the customer form. Let's click on the file tree over here to the left, and if we scroll up, we can go to our app directory that has the RS directory here in parentheses, and then customers, form, and there we should find the customer form that we were working on before. I'll press Control B to hide the file tree once again, so we have some extra room there. And just after our button import that we haven't used yet, but we will, let's go ahead and import the input we created. So I'll say import, I want input with label. It comes from components, inputs, and then the input with label. After that, let's scroll down to where we started the form in the previous lesson. And here we can see the form component from ShadCN. And currently we're just stringifying the form values inside of the body here, and we don't really have any inputs. So let's change that. But first I want to change something just quickly here inside of this class name that we set on the form in the last lesson. I had set this breakpoint here at small. I want to switch this to medium, and that means I also want to switch this one to medium. Everything else should stay the same. Okay, after that, we're ready to go ahead and add our input to the form. Well, I actually want to put this in columns because we're going to have more than one column. So the first column will be a div. Let's give it a class name. Let's set the classes here. We'll have flex. It will be flex-column. Give it a gap of 4. Width is full. And then the max width, let's set max. W, and then let's put that XS there for extra small once again. And if I mouse over that, you can see that's 320 pixels is what that max width XS is. Okay, now we have added the classes. We've got the closing div. So this will be the first column in our form. Now notice it's set to flex column, so that means we'd have one big column still when we're on smaller screens, but once we reach this medium breakpoint, which is 768 pixels, the same as an iPad in that tall mode there, not horizontal mode, but vertical, then it will switch to columns in an iPad. But on a phone, for example, it would all be stacked in one. So that's the layout we're going for, and of course you'll see that here as we put it all together. So inside this first column, we'll have our first input, the input with label. Right after that, we need to pass in the schema. And the schema we're using is the insert customer type schema. Okay, let's come down a line and we'll have a field title prop that we can pass in. Here we'll set this to first name. And after that, we'll put name in schema. And this is where it needs to match what we have in the React hook form default values here. So it's first name. If I choose that, I can put that in here. And afterwards, I'm not going to pass in any extra classes. So that's our input. Now notice how that matched. If I switch this to something else and just said Dave, now we get the red squiggly here. It's type safe, essentially. It's correcting us saying, hey, that name is not in the schema. And that's where we passed in our schema here as that generic. And so it's making sure we're putting in valid names. So the only names that'll work are the ones that are the keys in this schema. So let's undo that, Control Z. And now TypeScript is good with that, no squigglies, and everything's okay. So we can go ahead and put a few more inputs in our form, and then we'll check out how it works. So I'm going to select all of this, then do Shift Alt and the down arrow. And now I can switch first name to last name. So that's an easy one. I'll select the first one, Control D to select the next one. I'll type last, and it's replaced both. Make sure you have the casing correct, as this is a lowercase, this is an uppercase, And of course, this has to be an exact match to the schema for TypeScript to be good with that. Okay, after that, we're going to have an address 1 and an address 2. So Shift Alt and the down arrow once again. I can switch this to whatever we want the label to show is what would go here. So I'll put address 1. And now down below, we need to match the schema once again. So I think that was address. See, address is no good, but address 1. Yep, that's good. Now let's go ahead and put the next one in. Should be address 2. So I'll select number 1, Control D to select the next instance, and press 2. After that, I think we're going to go ahead and fit city and state yet in this column. So let's go ahead and copy this down here. And I'll do it again, Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. So I've got 2 of those. I'll switch this to city. And this would also be city. And then we're going to have state, but really let me go ahead and delete this because that's where we're going to use a select input. So we'll wait on that. Let's see how these look so far inside of the column, inside of the form. So we need to go check that out in the browser. When we go back here to Chrome, we'll go to our app. Now we're at our home page. We need to go to the customers page. So to do that, you need to go to customers/form. Go ahead and enter and see what we get here. So we've still got our stringified data out here to the right, and this is a new customer form, but here are the inputs we created over here in this column. So let's check it out now. Now, first name is required if you remember setting up the schema we did for our insert schema. So once I tab out of here and don't enter a first name, we get that instant feedback. It turns red. It says first name is required. Whatever message we set here inside of our schema is what will show as well. So we could change this message if we wanted to. Remember when we did that with Drizzle Zod, we were actually putting in those messages for the required fields. Likewise, last name is required. Address 1 is required. Address 2 wasn't required. So when I tab out of that, no problem. City, that's going to be required as well. So this is all working as expected. Let's put in the rest of the inputs that we're going to have here as far as our input with label goes in the customer form. And back in VS Code, let's go ahead and scroll up to copy this beginning div here from the first column so we can start our second column just underneath that. So underneath the closing div, I'll paste that in and start a new column here. Let's add the closing div as well. Save for the formatting. I'm going to delete the line that has JSON stringify with the form values as we'll no longer need that. Now let's copy one of these input with labels here. Control C to copy, and we'll paste this in below so we don't have to retype everything. Control V to paste, Control S to save, and now I've got the formatting I want, but now I've got a duplicate input here for city. So let's switch this to what we expect to see in the second column. We'll start with zip code, and I believe the name in the schema was zip. Now I can copy that down, Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. The next one is going to be email. And we'll turn this into a lowercase email, should match the schema. Okay, let's copy this one down, Shift, Alt, and the down arrow once again. This should be phone, so I'm just going to double click, then Control D to select both. Type phone. Make sure the casing matches though as well, because you want lowercase here to match the schema. That needs to be identical. This is what we display here with the uppercase and the field title value. Okay, after phone, we're also going to have a text area, which we haven't created yet, that will allow us to have some notes. And then we're going to have the submit and reset buttons. So let's start working on that area. I'll put a div wrapper around both buttons and set a class name here of flex and gap to 2. I want this to be a row because we want the buttons side by side. So now we're going to use that button component that we had imported from ShadCN. We'll set the type equal to submit. And now because this button is inside the form, anytime you do that with a submit button, you don't really need an on-click handler. This will call the onSubmit function of the form. Now I'll also put in a class name. I'm going to set our submit button with a width of 3/4. So it'll be the bigger button of the two inside the div. We can set a variant equal to default. And let's set the title equal to save. That's just when you mouse over and have your pointer looking at the button, for example. So let me go ahead and close the button out, and inside of the button we'll actually have the word save on it as well. Let me put that on a separate line, and then the button close on a separate line as well. Okay, so there is our save button. Now we can copy this down also. So highlight all of that, Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. So here is our second button. Now on this button, clearly we're not going to set it to be 3/4 width also. We had that before, so this button will just take up whatever is left. It's also not a submit button, so its type will just be button. Instead of default here, we'll set this to destructive, so ShadCN will change the styles on that based on the variant. We could also set an RA label if we wanted to, or a title, so we'll go ahead and have a title once again since we did that above. And let's set that to reset. Now we're going to need an onClick here. So I'll say onClick equals, inside of this we'll have our anonymous function. We'll call form.reset. We'll pass in the default values. So it will just set everything back to the original default values for the form. And we'll put the words reset on the form. We'll save that. Now we should be able to go back and take a look. Our form isn't complete. We're missing a text area we want. We're missing a select input for the state dropdown, but we have all of the text inputs, just the input with label, and that's most of the form. So now let's go back into our browser and take a look. It hasn't reset here yet from the validation that we had, so we could just go ahead and enter in some information. So once I type my name in and tab out, the error message goes away, and of course the color changes. Everything looks good. I'll just put in something 222 Street. Seems fine. We don't need anything there. Put in Kansas City. Now if I tab out of here, it gives us a longer message. Remember, we put in that longer message when we were creating the schema, but it's fine. It works here, so that's fine. We can put something in here like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for a zip code. Tab out, and that works. Email, if I just put in Dave, no good. But if I actually put in an email like dave@davegray.codes, that's fine. Phone number, it tells us what type of format to use once we receive that validation. So we could have 123-456-7890, and all is well. Now here is the reset button. So I can reset this form now, and it will clear all of these out and just go back to the defaults. So let me go ahead and try that. And yep, that's exactly what happened. Now, if I have validation here as well, if I have a message like that, where it says something's required and I wanted to reset all the inputs, I can do that with the reset button as well. We're back in VS Code again. Let's show the file tree, and we need to scroll back down to our components directory. And inside of components where we were creating inputs, you can click on the input with label if you want. And we need to create a new file here. So let's create a new one. Let's call this one Textarea with label.tsx. Now keep the input with label handy. I'll go ahead and Control B to hide the file tree, but we can click up here to switch between the two, because we want to copy a lot of this and just make a couple of changes. We don't need to type everything else out. I'm kind of a slow typer, but I can make these changes faster. So I'm copying line 1 through 19 here where we set the props. I'm going to move all of this over to the text area with label, Control V to paste that back in. And now here at the top, use client, that stays the same. Importing use form context, that stays the same. Importing everything here about the form from ShadCN with form control, form field, etc. All of that also stays. Now this is where a couple of things change right here. So instead of input, we're going to import the text area. So this would be text area, and it's going to come from the UI text area. But I don't like the dots again, as I have said before, so I want to have the @ components/UI/text_area. Then likewise, it's not input HTML attributes, it's Textarea HTML attributes. So Textarea HTML attributes, and we are good with the imports. I'll copy that and paste that right here for the props, the Textarea HTML attributes. This is also not HTML input element, it is HTML text area element. Notice the cap on the A as well, a capital A there. It's a lowercase a here. I'm not sure why the inconsistencies. I'm not the one that named those, but it's just worth noticing the details there. Okay, for props, we're once again passing in the schema as we will with all of these inputs we create. We're going to have a field title, we're going to have a name in schema. These are all consistent, and we're going to have a class name that we can use as well. So all of that has stayed the same. So notice we didn't have to change much. Let's go ahead and start the function now with export function, and we'll have text area with label. It's going to receive that generic, the schema, and then here where we destructure the props, we'll have to list them out. Field title, name in schema, and class name, and finally we will have the props themselves there. Okay, after that, we still need to mention the props here after the destructured object. So it's props, and it receives that generic S, the schema that we're going to reference. Now here, very similar to before. So we're going to say const form, set this equal to use form context, so we can reference the form inside of our text area with label component. Now, once again, this is going to use that anatomy of a form component that we saw at ShadCN, and we typed all of that out with the input with label. I don't really want to type it all again, so let's copy what we have, and we'll just change a few things as well just for the text area. So let's copy the whole form field. So that will go from the return parentheses, everything in between, Control C there. Let's come back to our component, and we can type return parentheses and just paste all of this in and make a few changes. But we won't have to change much. We're going to start off with a form field. It's going to have the form control that's the same. We'll use the same name in schema, and we'll start our render method with the field. Likewise, we're going to have the form item. Then we're going to have a form label that's going to use text base and HTML4. I want to add one thing here just because it doesn't seem to have as much space between the label and the input as the regular input. And I don't know why the text area is that way, but I'm going to put a margin bottom of 2 on the label for this one. We'll still have the field title here. So now we get down to the form control, and of course we're not using an input. I'll press Alt-Z to wrap these classes in. We're using a text area. So let's go ahead and use that text area here instead of the input. Now we'll have an ID that's name in schema. I'm not going to apply these classes here. So all we need to do to apply any classes here would be to pass the class name itself. Then we're going to have props and field here from React Hook Form. The props are anything we would typically pass in for a text area if we wanted to. This field is related to React Hook Form. It has the on change and things we would expect there. Everything else is the same. So we quickly created this component, and we can save the file. Now let's go put it in our customer form. I'm just going to click on the customer form that I still have open up here at the top. If you need to find it in your file tree, that's fine too. But now we're back in the customer form component, and above the buttons and below the phone input, let's put in our text area with label. I don't believe I've imported it yet, so I'm going to need to do that. Text area with label. And it's not going to have a whole lot that's passed into it. Oh, we also need, I should just come right back here. Let's copy this. I don't like to retype that long schema name, so I'll just put it right here. And then we're going to need the field title, which we'll just set equal to notes. And then we'll have a name in schema. And I believe to match what we had above inside of our React Hook form, that is just notes. Now let's pass in a class name. And here I'm just going to set the height, H40. We mouse over that, we should be able to see That's 160 pixels. So you'll be able to change the height to whatever you want because we can pass in that class name. Okay, everything looks good except we need the import. One way to import something in VS Code, if you haven't and you're down here like 100 lines into the code instead of at the top, I can just kind of hover over this and choose Quick Fix, and now I can add import. So I'll just click that and it's added the import for me at the top. If I go look, it is imported here just like we need. So now I'll save the file. And let's go to Chrome and check out our Textarea that is now part of our form here. So maybe we want to shorten this up, maybe we don't. It is still draggable, so if anybody, one of the users at the tech store, wanted to make it bigger or smaller, they could still manually do that if they want to also. Let me reload that and we'll get the form size that it's set to. So that looks pretty good. Now, it's not required, so I can tab out of it with no issue as well. But we're getting close now. All we need is our select input that will list out the 50 states plus the US territories. Okay, back in VS Code, let's open up the file tree once again, and let's scroll down to our components directory that we have. We can close that. I just wanted to be on this level, essentially, so I want to close any of these directories, honestly. And I want to click on something like the middleware here so I can create something new in this same level. And what I want to do is create a new directory and call this one constants. Now inside the constants directory, which you can see is now positioned right below the components directory, I want to create a new file and I want to call this statesarray.ts. Now, inside of this file, I'm just going to paste my contents, but I'm going to tell you how I created it. So let me first just paste all of this in, and you can see it's an array full of objects, and these objects have an ID and a description. And then they have the 2-letter abbreviation for the state or United States territory, and then the description is the full name. So for example, AL and Alabama. You can see I've got export const states array, and it equals this array that has all of these objects. Now here's how I created this, and you could do the same. I used AI. I can't remember if I went to ChatGPT or Claude because I use both at different times, but I typed this. I had this object, and I said, I need you to create an array for me that has an object for every state or United States territory that's formatted like this. And I gave this example because I live in Kansas, so I just typed this one out. So it created this for me. After that, when it provided that array, I just typed export const states array equals, and I was able to paste this in just like you see me doing. So in other words, you can do the same thing I did. I don't need to show you how to use ChatGPT or Claude. You can figure that out if you haven't used those, but there's different AIs out there that you can use. They're great for generating data like this. So I didn't have to look everything up. I'm fairly aware of all 50 states and the territories. And this was good enough for an example. If this was very serious, I would of course be going to the United States Postal website, verifying I had each one of these absolutely correct. So I'm going to save this, and we're going to use this data inside of the select input. So in the customer form, we can choose which state or territory that the customer is from. And now it's time to go back into our components directory and then the inputs directory inside. I'm just going to click on input with label once again and scroll to the top, copy these same 19 lines to start off with, and we're going to create our select input. So Control C to copy that. Now a new file, and I'm going to call this select with label.tsx. To start off with, I'll just paste in those same 19 lines, and we'll make a few changes. So once again, use client directive at the top. Use form context will be imported from React Hook form. We need all of the same form inputs from ShadCN as well. After that, this is where things change once again. We're going to need select inputs, and I'm not going to import something else here like we did for the input HTML attributes from React, because the select input is more of a custom input. It uses some different things than your normal HTML input would. and those props don't line up exactly. So I'm not planning on extending that out. However, let's go ahead and import what we need from ShadCN for the select. So we need select. We also need select content, select item, select trigger, and select value. And all of those are going to come from @/components/UI/select. And that's all we need from ShadCN for the select. And we can go ahead and create that. First, I have a second type I'm going to put here. I'm going to say type, and I'm going to call this data object, but just obj for short. Set this equal to an object that resembles what we have in that states array here. So an ID that's a string and a description is a string as well. Now we can use that in our props type here. So we're still going to have a field title, and we're still going to receive the generic and have name in schema. We'll also have the class name, but before the class name, I'm going to put in data. It's going to be that data object type, and then it's going to be an array of those objects. So this is what we want to represent there, and it will be the states array that we can pass in to this component. But if we wanted to use it for other data, we would be able to as well. Let's go ahead and save these changes with Control S, and now I'll go back to the input label. And in the past, I just started typing here for the export function, but this time I think I'm just going to select the entire function because there aren't many changes. I'll Control C, and we'll just be able to make the changes we need. So I'm going to paste in the function first, and then scroll back up here, and we'll change input with label to select with label. After that, we'll just make sure we've got our props correct, and it's a little different because we have field title, name and schema, and then it should be data before class name. Then we'll have then we'll have class name, but after that, we won't be spreading in any props as we did previously with the Textarea or the input. And then of course we'll have the props here and the generic. So all of that still stays the same. We're still going to define the form with use form context. We'll still start a form field, have the control, the name for name and schema, and start the render function here as well. Okay, after that, we'll still start out with a form item, and we'll have a form label. It's going to have the text base class and use the name and schema. It's still going to use the field title. So everything is still on par as we get to line 50. At line 50, some things are going to change. So I'm going to scroll for a little bit of room, and I'm going to tab over here because this is where we'll start, and this is where we put our select. And now I'm going to come down to a new line, and I'm going to spread in the field as you've previously seen me spread that in with the other inputs. And then we're going to have an on value change. And now this is going to equal field.onChange. So that's a little different. We couldn't spread in that on value change with the field here because this is just a little different. So we pass in the field.onChange to that on value change here for the select. Okay, now we have finish the select here. I shouldn't put the slash here before the greater than sign though. I actually want a closing select later on. So I've put the select here. Let's put the closing select where it belongs. And that's going to be right down here before the form message. So let's close it out right here, /select. Now when I save, we should get the reformatting. So we've wrapped the select around the form control. Now things will also be different inside the form control. First, I'm going to press Control B to hide the file tree again, then Alt Z to wrap anything that needs to be wrapped. And let's just go ahead and delete the input here inside the form control, because here we're going to use a select trigger. Now the select trigger is going to have the ID, and that's going to be the name in schema. After that, we're also going to have a class name here. And here we're going to do what you saw me do with the input. So I'm going to put a couple of classes and then put class name at the end so it could either overwrite these or add to them. So we'll have width full, max width, extra small, and then we'll pass in the class name prop. Okay, after class name, we're going to go ahead and close out the trigger. And then inside this trigger, we're going to have the select value we imported. We can put a placeholder here. So this will display whatever we want when there isn't a selection. So I'm just going to call this select. Okay, now we've got our select trigger. That's what will start the whole thing. But now we also need the content for the select. So we'll start our select content, and it will have its own closing tag. Now inside of here is where we're going to map over the data. So this would be our states array, for example. So now we map over this for each item in the array. I'll put another parentheses there. We want to create a select item. Let me scroll just a little bit. And now we'll have select item. Now each select item should have a key as when you map over items. So this key, I'm going to put in a template literal. And we'll think about this because this is something where you might use more than one select input on a page. We won't be on the customer form, but if you were to use it somewhere else, maybe you would. So think about that when you name the key so you don't have duplicate keys. So we'll pass in the name in schema first. So that should be kind of unique for that specific input. And then we can still use the item.id, for example. So when you combine those two, it should definitely be unique, even if you have another select on the same page. After that, let's pass in the value, which is the item.id. And now let's close out the select item. Inside the select item, though, we want to display the item.description. So that's what the user would read, but the value that's actually passed to the form is the ID itself. Okay, we should have a full select component now. So once again, it starts the same, but then it's a little different here where the select wraps around the form control. Then it has a trigger, and then we have the content that displays after it is triggered. Okay, let's go back to the file tree now and find our way back to the customer form where we need to import our new select input. Here it is. So with that, let's just import it right here. I'll say import, and we want select with label. It should come from components, input, select with label. Once again, Control B to hide the file tree, Alt Z to wrap any other lines down. And when I look at these imports here, I can see since I added this one automatically, as we did earlier with VS Code, it put it at the bottom of the imports, but I'm just going to cut it with Control X. Put it underneath the select here. So we have all of these imports together here as the inputs, all of the imports of the inputs. There we go, a tongue twister. So we have all of those together, and that'll just be a little more organized. Okay, when I come down here below, we want to find city, and then we would have state. So this is where we would have our select input. So we have select with label, and this is also going to have the same schema we pass into it, so we know everything else is type safe. So we'll have field title, set this equal to state, and now this is where the generic would check the name in the schema, and I think it was lowercase state. And now we need to pass the data, and we haven't imported that states array yet, so we'll want to do that back at the top. We can save that much, and just right now we have a lack of data, I should say, right there. So let's import that states array up here. We can do that with import states array, and that should come from @constants and then /states array. So now we have our data. Let's copy that, and we'll insert it here for the data prop. And it looks good. Let's go back to our form in Chrome and check everything out. It says we have a couple of errors. Let's go ahead and refresh and see if everything's okay or if we still have those. Okay, back in VS Code, I'm going to hold down Control and click on Select with Label just to check out our component and see if I did anything wrong here. I easily could have. As I scroll down, I've got the form control, and I instantly see the error. We should have only had the form control wrapped around our trigger. So let's put the closing tag after the closing select trigger, and then the select content after that. That is what we should have there. So that is what I did wrong along the way. Now let's go back and once again look at our form, see if we have gotten past any errors. Yep, no more error here in the form. Let's check out our drop menu. When I click on that, we have got the full 50 states plus a lot of US territories in here, and we should be able to select one. Let me select Kansas, for example. And yes, it populates the field. Everything looks fairly good there. Let's go ahead, fill out some data, and then we'll have to look at everything, say, inside of the dev console and see if we're logging all of that data with our onSubmit function. So I'll just put Kansas City right here. We've already got Kansas. We'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Put my email here. 123-456-7890 and test message. Okay, let me go ahead and open up Chrome DevTools here with Control Shift and the letter I. And now when we submit, if I remember right, we've already got a console log in there. So when the onSubmit is called, yes, it logs the data over here and we can check everything out. And we are getting all of that data as expected. Now this is a new customer, so the ID is 0 right now, and that is fine. We'll identify that as we submit to our server action. But right now, we just know we're getting the data from the form as expected. Let's go ahead and close that back out. Now, what if their customer already existed? Let's try an edit form, as we'd already set that up too. So customer ID equals 2, press enter. And yep, the form is already populated as it loads. So that's what we wanted as well. Everything looks good. We've created all those inputs and we've completed the customer form except for the submission process to our server action. And everything is type safe. It gives us that information. So if I delete Jane's name here and tab out, we get that immediate feedback that we do need a first name. Put Jane's name back, tab out, and everything is good. So now let's apply these inputs to the ticket form, and we're going to need one more, and that's a checkbox. Hey, I also want to quickly point out that when we had the new customer form and we hit reset, it cleared everything. But when we have edit customer, because of the way we populate the default values inside of our form, if I delete Jane's name here and then I hit reset, it brings Jane's name back because these are the default values that we set up as that data comes into the form. Okay, let's get started on the ticket form. Back in VS Code, we can open up the file tree, but I'm just going to click on the customer form that I have open up here above. Scroll to the top at first, and these inputs that we have here, the input with label, select with label, and text area with label, we're going to use all of those in the ticket form as well. So let's go ahead and grab all of these, and I can just copy them because we're using these imports that start with the @ symbol, and so they work anywhere. Even if the file path would be different, it knows where to grab everything from. So we've got customer form here, so tickets form, and then ticket form here. So we'll scroll up to the top, and we'll make sure we've got all three of those inputs we've already created. I'll press Alt-Z to wrap those down. After that, we'll scroll down to the form area, and notice I've still got customer form up here, so I can go back and forth between the two because I'm going to hide the file tree with Control-B again. I'm going to scroll down to the form area we had. We can go ahead and delete the stringify line here as we'll start creating our form. Let's go ahead and also just kind of model one form after the other where we're going to have columns. Just in case I had started out with a little bit different of class names there, I'm going to come to the form here in the customer form, copy this line that has my class names on the form, put in the same class names just to match right here inside of our ticket form. So now I have identical setup and I didn't type anything differently that way. We can also start our columns that way if we wanted. So if we go back to the customer form, remember this div indicated our first column. And then I'll go ahead and copy this input label as well. So right down here, so we'll start our column and we'll have a text input here, our input with label. Copy both of those things. Paste those in here, and then we'll close out that div. So we will have started our first column. Save that. Now we don't have an insert customer schema type here in the ticket form, do we? We have a different one. We have insert ticket schema type. So I'll copy that, come back down to our input, paste in the correct schema there. Now you can see first name does not match this schema. So we need to look at the inputs that we've set up here above. So we're going to have an ID, customer ID. Whether we want to show all of these on the page or not is something else. We also have title, description, completed, and tech. We'll start with title. So let's scroll down and get started on this input now. So here we're going to have the title of the ticket. And I'll just change this to match the actual schema. So title, that looks good. Let's have another input here. And here, let's go ahead and put an input with label for now. And I say for now because in the next tutorial, we're going to work on permissions. And remember, only managers and admins should be able to assign the tech to the ticket. But for now, say anybody viewing this ticket would at least be able to see who was assigned. So instead of a select here where a manager or an admin might use it, let's use an input and let's just show the tech that is assigned. And of course, right now, if I remember correctly, all of the tickets we have in our database just say new ticket. We have that new ticket email, but we'll go ahead and display it at least. And I'll put in tech to match the schema. There we go. One other thing though, because we have those props, we can pass in a read-only prop. And we'll just set this equal to true. Now, after this input is where I'd want to put the checkbox, but we haven't created the checkbox yet. So let's just go ahead and put everything else in the form, and then we'll go create the checkbox. So for now, I'm going to put a div with a class name, set a margin top equal to 4, and then a space -y-2. We have a little bit of space between what I'm going to put inside the div. Here, we're just going to display the customer information. It won't be in inputs. It won't be anything that can be changed. It's just who the ticket is assigned to, because remember, every ticket needs to start with a customer. So here I'll have an H3 class name, set this equal to text large. And now inside of this, we'll just put in customer info. Oh, and it looks like it closed out that H3 here before I started the class name. That looks better. Okay, after that, let's put in a horizontal rule. I'll set the class name equal to a width of 4/5, just 4/5 of the div. This one will be self-closing. Okay, now let's put in a paragraph, and inside of this, we'll put in the customer. Oops, we need all lowercase. Customer.first name. Let's put in a space and put in customer.last name. On the next line, we'll put in customer.address1. And then on the next line, possibly an address 2. So let's think about how to handle that. We could say, well, let's use a ternary. Let's say customer.address2. And if it exists, well, you know what? We shouldn't start with the paragraph if we're going to do that. Let's display the paragraph if it exists. Then we'll display our customer address 2. And otherwise would be null. Okay, after that, now let's put in another paragraph. And this would be our customer city. We can put a comma, have customer state value, and a space, and the customer zip value. Again, just all being displayed here on the form page for reference for who the ticket is for. Now let's put in another horizontal rule. Class name equals a width of 4/5, just like we had above, so I could have copied that. After that, we'll have another one that has the email. So here's another paragraph, customer.email. And as you might guess, we would have a customer phone. So let's put this in, and here I'll put in phone, and we'll say customer phone. Okay, that looks good for our first column, remembering that we still want a checkbox here at some point. And we can quickly finish the second column. Let's go ahead and copy the beginning div once again so they're equal. Come down here to where the second column would start. We get the closing div immediately. Now we're going to have two things in this, a text area and then our area with the buttons. So let's go back to the customer form. Scroll down in the customer form. Here was a text area with label. So we can copy that from line 110 to 114. Control C. Go back to our ticket form. Paste in our text area and think about what will be different here. Well, we have to put in the different schema type. I'll change those out. And then the field title, it won't be the same. This is going to be a description of the ticket. So we had description, and this would be description all lowercase as well. And that should match a name in the schema, and it does. Let's make this taller. I'll put in 96. Let's mouse over that and see how much that is. That's 384 pixels. So a nice tall area, text area for the description of the ticket. After that, we're going to have really the same form buttons that we did in our customer form. So let's go back, grab this same area that we had here with the div, flex, and gap 2. So select that entire div, Control C to copy, back to our ticket form. And now this is actually going to be inside this column. We'll make sure we put it in the right place. And there we should have it. I'm going to delete a couple of extra lines here. Let's take a look. So once I save, it's formatted correctly. It's a submit button. We still have the default save with the save name here. And then when we look at our reset button, it is once again the same and passes in the default values as well when it is reset. So that looks great. Let's look at our form. And of course, the only thing that's missing is the checkbox that would go here after the tech name. So back in Chrome, we need to be able to pull up the form though. So instead of customers, we're going to go to tickets, and then we can say customer ID 2, and it would be a new ticket if we do that, but we're going to at least have a customer assigned to it. So this is what we would get. We have a blank ticket title and a blank description, both required. And after that, we have the new ticket example. We can't change it. It's not disabled though, as far as the color didn't change for the text here at all, but it is read only. So we didn't see a color change, but we do see that we can't change this at this point. Then we have the customer info right here to reference. So that's basically what was expected. I can reset that, get rid of those messages as well. We could type something in here like computer fixed. And we could type something in over here and say, won't work. And everything is good. That's all that's really needed or required to complete the form are those two fields. Except we're going to have a completed checkbox as well. But of course, with a new ticket, it would never actually be completed. But let's look at an existing ticket as well. So we have customer ID of 2, we don't need the customer ID when we have the ticket ID because it will pull the customer in. That's correct. So ticket ID equals 4. There we go. Now we have an edit ticket number 4, and you can see this is already completed. So we have the customer info, pulled in the title, and the description as well. So this tech field, this is going to get adjusted in the next lesson when we actually set up permissions also, because right now it's a read only, so everybody can read who it's assigned to, but only an admin or manager would actually be able to make the assignment. Back in VS Code, we could fix that read-only color in a couple of ways before we move on to the checkbox. One would be to pass in classes for the read-only color. The other would be to set up disabled instead of read-only, because we actually put in colors in our input with label definition. If you remember, I'll hold down Control and click on that for the possibility of it being disabled. So let's go ahead and roll with disabled for now, and we'll look back at the form to see if it has changed colors for our input there. And there you can see now the tech with the new ticket at example.com is now green. And if I switch to the light theme, it's now blue because those are the colors that we put in. So let's go ahead and go with those for now. So it makes them stand out just a little bit. Or you could decide to possibly change that color if you want. To do that, you would go into the input with label definition, or you could override it by passing in a different class as well, which would also work. Okay, let's go back and create that checkbox now. Back in VS Code, once again, I'm going to click on the file tree, but I also have the input with label up here, and either way you get there, you just want to get to that inputs directory, and we're going to create one more file in this directory. So I'll create our new file here. I'm going to call this checkbox with label.tsx. As we have with the other inputs we've created, let's go back to that input with label file first. Also, I'm going to press Control B to hide the file tree so I can switch back and forth up here at the top. And I'm going to copy the first 19 lines and just see what we need to change once again. So everything through the props, Control C to copy, back into checkbox with label, Control V to paste. As I scroll up, we still have the use client directive. We're going to use form context. We're going to need all of the different form inputs. And once again, here is where things change. So we don't need input or input HTML attributes. We do need import, and then we want checkbox, and that's going to come from @/components/UI/checkbox. Okay, then we've got the checkbox to work with, and we can start in on the props. We'll go ahead and delete this input HTML attributes. We're going to have a field title. We're going to have the name and schema that uses the generic, so we can pass in the schema. And instead of a class name here, we're going to have a message, and it's not going to be optional. So let's go ahead and remove the optional part of that. So a message that is a string, and that's what we'll go with. Now let's go ahead and create the function. I'm going to once again do that same thing where I copy the function as well and make some changes because it's that same type of form input layout we have seen in these other inputs. So now paste in the function itself, and we're going to call this checkbox with label. And then we're going to have the field title that matches, the name and schema that matches, no class name, no props being passed in, but we will have a message prop right here. After that, props with the schema, that is all the same. The form uses the form context, and we start into the return for the form field. It's going to once again use a form control. It's going to use the name in the schema and start the render method. And at the render method, things become just a little different because this is a checkbox and the label's not going to be above it. It's going to be to the side all in one line here. So let's add some classes that will help with all of this. Whoa, I typed totally different things than I intended to. I want class name right here. I'm going to set this equal to width, full, flex, and then items-center, gap-2. Okay, now for the form label, I'm going to have text base, but then I'm also going to have width-1/3 and a margin top of 2. HTML form, name and schema, that's the same. Field title is the same. Now we come down to the form control, and I'm going to wrap this form control in a div. I'll put some classes on this div, so we'll set this equal to class names flex, flex dash, oops, sorry, not flex dash, it's going to be items dash center and gap dash 2. I'll put the closing div after the form control. And we're also going to have our message. So whatever message is passed in will go right here. Now let's look at the form control itself. It's not going to be this input, it's going to be a checkbox. Now that checkbox is still going to have the ID with name in schema. We're not going to have any of these class names on it at all. So we can eliminate those. We're not passing any props here, but we will have field props passed from React Hook form. Now this is different because once again, much like the select, this is a custom checkbox from ShadCN, so it has onChecked change. And we'll set this equal to the field.onChange from React Hook form. After that, we should be good, I think. Yep, we've got everything we need, and that is the complete checkbox input. So we're ready now to put that inside of our ticket form. You can go back to the file tree to find the ticket form, but if I close the file tree, I've got mine right up here at the top. So either way, you want to navigate back to your ticket form, and we want to put that checkbox in. The first thing we need to do is import it up here at the top. I'm going to import checkbox with label. While I'm up here, note that we haven't used the select with label yet on the ticket form, and we won't until the next lesson, because that's where we will be able to select different texts if we're a manager or admin as far as those permissions go. Okay, now as we scroll down, just want to find where we want to put that checkbox, and it comes before the customer info and after the tech. So here's where we'll have our checkbox with label, and now it should have, well, it should also have, I almost skip that every time, we need to pass the schema as well. Now on the next line, we're going to select or set the field title. And you know what? Instead of a field title that's passed in, we're just going to set this to completed. Then we could say name in schema. This would be the name schema. And after that, we're going to have a message, and we're going to pass in yes. Oh, and here I'm thinking like two different things. Here is not where we have the name in schema prop. This is where we would actually match what's above. So yep, it's getting to be a little bit of a long tutorial, and I need to clear up my thinking. So as we save that checkbox with label, now we have the field title completed. It's going to be a checkbox. It matches our schema that says completed, and beside the checkbox, it's going to say yes. So we know to check the checkbox if yes, it is completed. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and take a look at our ticket form once again. And here is our checkbox field. It's completed. We can check it or uncheck it, and everything should be working as expected there as well. So let's go ahead, quickly look at the dev tools again. I'll clear out the console here. Let's check it as if it was completed. We have screen replacement, description, and everything else here, the text. So let's save, see what we get over here. So we have completed is true. So this is a Boolean. We get true or false. That matches our schema, the customer ID, the description, and everything else as expected in the form. Now, if we reset this, everything is basically back to the way it was. I noticed that our completed did not reset. We may need to fix that. Okay, so back in VS Code, to fix our checkbox, we want to hold down the control button and click on checkbox with label, which should take us to that file. So you could just open that file either way that you want to get there. Once we're there, we just missed adding one field here. After the field that is spread in and before onChecked changed, we need to just put checked and set that equal to field, if I could spell, value. And this will keep it checked or unchecked. So let's go ahead and save that. And now let's go back to the browser and check out our field once again. So I'm going to reload the page just to make sure everything loads in as expected. Okay, with the page now loaded, let's go ahead and check everything out. If we hit save right now, you can see we have a false over here in our console window. And now if we click the completed box and hit save, it is true. So that's good. Let's clean this out once again. And now let's hit reset. And it does uncheck as expected. Now let's hit save to make sure it once again says false. Yep, everything's working as we want it to. So we've pretty much completed our ticket and our customer forms. We just need to come back in the next tutorial and address the permissions so tickets can be assigned to individual texts that are users in our application. A quick shout out to my patrons. Holy Coder is a progress provider. Sean Lynch is a senior patron. And my junior patrons, Programming Polyglot, Isaac, Will, Ernie, Stacy, Abe, Javier, Michael. Thank you all so very much. You're helping me reach my goals. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.